think we can get into it. We're going to do a slightly different format than we've done for the last couple of office hours and kind of go back to roots. Like in my mind, roots were there was a 2-year period where a handful of folks would get together weekly, I think, and like actively work on really real projects. No slides, no, it was like, I'm dealing with this problem, please help, which often came in the format of hey, Erik Harpstead or Stefan Slater, will you please help me with these statistics? Because I don't know any statistics.